Okay, continuing, actually video 3. We were cut off there, batteries ran out. Alright, so the mycoplasma will only crystallize at 8.1 pH, and the blood has a pH of 7.4. So, the end result is that the doctor thinks your complaint is all in your head. Okay, crystalline, brucella and multiple sclerosis. In 1998 in Rochester, New York, I met a former military man, PFC Donald Bentley, who gave me a document and told me I was in the US Army and I was trained in bacteriological warfare. We were handling a bomb filled with brucellosis, only it wasn't brucellosis, it was brucella toxin in a crystalline form. We were spraying it on the Chinese and the North Koreans. He showed me his certificate listing his training in chemical, biological and radiological warfare. Then he showed me 16 pages of documents given to him by the US military when he was discharged from the service. They linked brucellosis with multiple sclerosis and stated in one section, veterans with multiple sclerosis, a kind of creeping paralysis, developing to a degree of 10% or more disability within 2 years for disability compensation. Compensation is payable to eligible veterans whose disabilities are due to service. In other words, if you become ill with multiple sclerosis, it is because you were handling this brucella and we will give you a pension. Don't go raising any fuss about it. In these documents, the government of the US revealed evidence of the cause of multiple sclerosis, but they did not make it known to the public or to your doctor. In a 1949 report, Drs. Kiger and Hayden suggested the possibility that MS might be a central nervous system manifestation of chronic brucellosis. Testing approximately 113 MS patients, they found that almost 95% also tested positive for brucella. We have a document from a medical journal which concludes that 1 out of 500 people who had brucellosis would develop what they call neurobrucellosis. In other words, brucellosis in the brain, where the brucella settles in the lateral ventricles, where the disease multiple sclerosis is basically located. The contamination of Camp Dietrich lab workers. A 1948 New England Journal of Medicine report titled Acute Brucellosis Among Laboratory Workers shows us how actively dangerous this agent is. The laboratory workers were from Camp Dietrich, Frederick, Maryland, where they were developing biological weapons. Even though these workers had been vaccinated, they wore rubberized suits and masks and worked through holes in the compartment. Many of them came down with this awful disease because it is so absolutely and terrifyingly infectious. The article was written by Lieutenant Coldren Howe, Marine Corps, Captain Edward Miller, Marine Corps, Lieutenant Emily Kelly, United States Naval Reserve, and Captain Henry Bookman. They were all military personnel engaged in making the disease agent brucella into a more effective biological weapon. Then comes the covert testing of mycoplasma. Testing the dispersal methods. Documented evidence proves that the biological weapons they were developing were tested on the public in various communities without their knowledge or consent. The government knew that crystalline brucella would cause disease in humans. Now they needed to determine how it would spread and the best way to disperse it. They tested dispersal methods for Brucella sui and Brucella melanoensis at Dugway Proving Ground, Utah in June and September 1952. Probably 100% of us now are infected with both Brucella sui and Brucella melanoensis. Another government document recommended the genesis of open-air vulnerability tests and covert research and development programs to be conducted by the Army and supported by the CIA. At that time, the government of Canada was asked by the US government to cooperate in testing weaponized brucella, and Canada cooperated fully with the US. The US government wanted to determine whether mosquitoes would carry the disease and also if the air would carry it. And going back to that opening paragraph on our first video, a government report stated that open-air testing of infectious biological agents is considered essential to an ultimate understanding of biological warfare potentialities because of the many unknown factors affecting the degradation of microorganisms in the atmosphere. Okay, testing by the mosquito vector in Punta Gorda, Florida. A report from the New England Journal of Medicine reveals that one of the first outbreaks of chronic fatigue syndrome was in Punta Gorda, Florida, back in 1957. It was a strange coincidence that a week before these people came down with this chronic fatigue syndrome, there was a huge influx of mosquitoes. The National Institutes of Health claimed that the mosquitoes came from a forest fire 30 miles away. The truth is that those mosquitoes were infected in Canada by Dr. Guilford B. Reid at Queen's University. They were bred in Belleville, Ontario, and taken down to Punta Gorda and released there. Within a week, the first 5 cases ever of chronic fatigue syndrome were reported to the local clinic in Punta Gorda. The cases kept coming until finally 450 people were ill with the disease. Testing by mosquito vector in Ontario. The Government of Canada had established the Dominion Parasite Lab in Bellevue, Ontario, going back again to the opening statement of our first video, where it raised 100 million mosquitoes a month. These were shipped to the Queen's University and certain other facilities to be infected with this crystalline disease agent. The mosquitoes were then let loose in certain communities in the middle of the night, so that the researchers could determine how many people would become ill with chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, which was the first disease to show. One of the communities they tested it on was the St. Lawrence Seaway Valley, all the way from Kingston to Cornwall in 1984. They let out hundreds of millions of infected mosquitoes. Over 700 people in the next 4 or 5 weeks developed myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome. Covert testing of other disease agents. Mad cow disease, kuru, in the Foray tribe. And I've read this to you before, but we'll go over it because it's so pertinent to what Brian and I are doing in Papua New Guinea. Before and during World War II, at the infamous Camp 731 in Manchuria, the Japanese military contaminated prisoners of war with certain disease agents. They also established a research camp in New Guinea in 1942. There they experimented upon the Foray Indian tribe and inoculated them with a minced-up version of the brains of diseased sheep containing the Visna virus, which causes mad cow disease, or Creutzfeldt and Jakob disease. About 5 or 6 years later, after the Japanese had been driven out, the poor people of the Foray tribe developed what they called kuru, which was their word for wasting, and they began to shake, lose their appetites and die. The autopsies revealed that their brains had literally turned to mush. They had contracted mad cow disease from the Japanese experiments. When the war ended, Dr. Ishii Shiro, the medical doctor who was commissioned as a general in the Japanese army so he could take command of Japan's biological warfare development, testing and deployment, he was captured. He was given the choice of a job with the United States Army or execution as a war criminal. Not surprisingly, he chose to work with the US military to demonstrate how the Japanese had created mad cow disease in the Foray Indian tribe. 1957, when the disease was beginning to blossom in full among the Foray people, Dr. Carlton Kajusek of the US National Institutes of Health headed to New Guinea to determine how the minced-up brains of the Visna-infected sheep affected them. He spent a couple of years there studying the Foray people, wrote an extensive report, and won the Nobel Prize for discovering kuru disease in the Foray tribe. Testing carcinogens over Winnipeg, Manitoba. In 1953, the US government asked the Canadian government if it could test a chemical over the city of Winnipeg. It was a big city with 500,000 people, miles from anywhere. The American military sprayed this carcinogenic chemical in a 1,000% attenuated form, which they said would be so watered down that nobody would get very sick. However, if people came to clinics with a sniffle, a sore throat, or ringing in their ears, the researchers would be able to determine what percentage would have developed cancer if the chemical had been used at its full strength. We located evidence that the Americans had indeed tested this carcinogenic chemical, zinc cadmium sulfide, over Winnipeg in 1953. We wrote to the Government of Canada explaining that we had solid evidence of the spraying and asking that we be informed as to how high up in the government the request for permission to spray had gone. We did not get a reply. Shortly after, the Pentagon held a press conference on May 14, 1997, where they admitted what they had done. Robert Russo, writing for the Toronto Star from Washington, D.C., reported the Pentagon's admission that in 1953 it had obtained permission from the Canadian government to fly over the city of Winnipeg and spray out this chemical, which sifted down on kids going to school, housewives hanging out their laundry, and people going to work. US Army planes and trucks released the chemical 36 times between July and August 1953. The Pentagon got its statistics, which indicated that if the chemical release had been full strength, approximately a third of the population of Winnipeg would have developed cancers over the next 5 years. One professor, Dr. Hugh Butenberg, MD, twice nominated for the Nobel Prize, wrote a magazine article stating that the Pentagon came clean on this because two researchers in Sudbury, Ontario, Don Scott and his son Bill, had been revealing this to the public. However, the legwork was done by other researchers. The US Army actually conducted a series of simulated germ warfare tests over Winnipeg. The Pentagon lied about the tests to the mayor, saying that they were actually testing a chemical fog over the city which would protect Winnipeg in the event of a nuclear attack. A report commissioned by US Congress, chaired by Dr. Roisin Henderson, lists 32 American towns and cities used as test sites as well. Here ends our 3/4 video. There's more.